So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to Dr. Fiona Anderson, art historian at Newcastle University, who will introduce you to the rest of the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming. I'm going to introduce the panellists and then we'll have a chat for about 30 to 40 minutes and then open it out for questions. Bearing in mind we're being shared live on Facebook. Looking as we do like this queer Last Supper. So Oliver Doe is an artist, writer and curator living here in Newcastle, and he is the curator of this exhibition. Rachel Ara lives and works in London. She was winner of the Aesthetica Art Prize in 2016 and was recently awarded a 2017-18 fellowship from Near Now, Broadway's Studio for Arts, Design and Innovation in Nottingham. Garth Gratrix lives in Blackpool and he is the director of Abingdon Studios and curator at ICW Blackpool and undertook a residency at Topshed in Norfolk in 2017. Charlotte Cullen lives in Leeds and they are currently the recipient of a doctoral studentship with the Centre for Sculptural Thinking at the University of Huddersfield and were selected for a UK Young Artist 2016. So to start off this discussion about queering contemporary minimalism, this idea of reading into it, I wanted to start by thinking about the meaning, the currency of this term queer and how it relates to your own practice. So I wanted to maybe starting with you, Ollie, and then moving along, thinking about the meaning and application of the term queer and about what you think happens to it when we attach it to words like art and to words like minimalism. What does that mean to you?
I mean, for me, it came out, in my personal use, came from a point of my own sort of sexual gender identity when I then came to making art that was about my person, who I am, as any artist I'm sure does. That then started to feed into it and it became an easier way than pinpointing down one specific way of thinking about identity that could represent a spectrum of ideas and feelings about oneself. I think it is that non-specificity does allow what I'm making in terms of being an artist to be more open-ended. It allows for room for manoeuvre in ideas and aesthetics, but I think still encapsulates everything that I'm thinking about in terms of both my person and my practice, whether that's political, social or personal.
Mm-hmm. I really like that idea of room for manoeuvre. It's really interesting, particularly when I'm thinking about the objecthood of this work as well. Rachel?
I'm confused.
Yeah. Share it with us.
I will share it with you. I mean, in terms of the word queer, I mean, queer to me used to mean gay. And that's how I see it, but it seems to have changed. I mean, I see queer as the new straight now. I mean, having been off-grid, I lived off-grid for about 10-15 years, where I wasn't in touch with anything and what was going on. And I mean, I was part of sort of political activism when it was just lesbian and gay march. And now you've got all these acronyms, so I've sort of come back to this society, which is quite alien to me. You know, Charlotte's been explaining, you've been explaining what actually the term means, but I'm still trying to get to grips with what it means. In my head, it's still gay, but it's not really gay. But I mean, it was interesting to be invited, to be part of the show, because you made me actually think of my work in terms of queer, which I never really have done before. And then I really can't help doing anything that's not. So I'm not really into the theory. I don't read it, I just live it. So what comes out is what comes out. So it's been really great to be part of this and having to think of the words of queer and what that means in terms of my work. And I think that certainly helped.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like you're saying something similar to Ollie about this relationship between person and practice as well. Yeah.
Well, I mean, you can't really separate. Well, for me, you can't really separate the two. They are what they are.
But then they're not always exactly the same thing at the same time. I think there's always a certain level of disconnect between the two, to an extent.
Yes. No, I don't know whether I agree with that actually.
That's what I find.
Okay.
as with definitions of queer, everyone has their own
Yes.
way of practice as an artist.
Yes.
That reflects who they are.
And that's what's interesting working with different generations, because I was saying my work on the wall out there, the high clone piece, is the same age as Ollie. It's a generation apart. So that's been really great to work with that. Mm-hmm.
Hello. Yeah, for me, I never set out to look at queer as a gay man. It was queerness in terms of an openness in experimentation as a process and figuring out what I perceive as peculiar or weird in the environments that I find myself as an artist, if this is making any sense to anyone. So, yeah, I don't necessarily start based on my sexuality to begin with. I'm interested in an experience of queerness, which I might not argue academically, but I think there's a foundation there to suggest that most art experience in modern society is queer to some extent. So that's kind of where I'm intrigued as an artist to help figure that out, but inevitably involve identity and my sexuality on a kind of more literal level, but still leave some room for obliqueness and room for manoeuvre, like you say, in terms of experimentation, which is kind of where I always start a process of making.
Okay. Well, I started that, I need to keep moving. Well, I think for me, queerness in my life is as much sort of a refusal of the labels that exist within the gay community, a refusal and also not necessarily fitting in to where sort of those binaries fall. And I think politically and socially, queerness is that in-between space that is not within the binaries, and politically kind of refusing to work with them. So it's an interesting thing in art because that refusal of being sort of within these poles can sort of, can sort of be taken up in quite different ways, I think. So I think that's where the idea of queerness becomes like quite open within practice and vary, and where does that kind of essential kind of queerness as a radical act, as a radical position kind of exist now. Yes. But I really like in terms of minimalism queering that form, like challenging that and having that kind of come through as sort of refusal of what was there before, trying to explore that. And I mean, it comes through in your practice. If I wanted to make clean, crisp, masculine, like minimalist art, it's just not going to happen. So it kind of comes out and it's just like, oh yeah, this is this thing. So, yeah.
Can I just check everyone can hear okay? No? Yeah?
Start again.
It's interesting in your responses. There's an interesting, I don't know if it's so much as a tension, but quite a complex relationship between this idea of you're thinking about making queer art or making art queerly as being about open-endedness, but at the same time, I can see where Ollie you're coming from with titling the show, this idea of you're reading into it. That if we talk about work, sculptural work, any artwork as queer, or we kind of gender or sexualize it in that way, that there's a sense of kind of reading into or projecting. I wonder what we think the relationship is between, we're saying at once it's open-ended, but it's also this kind of idea of reading into something. Because I know that quite a few people that I've spoken to about the show, they have this sort of knowing smile when they read the title. It's a response to work that's familiar to them, this idea of that if you make it about something personal or if you read into something, it's a projection. So I wonder what your thoughts are about this. How do we kind of connect this flexibility, this open-endedness, and how does it fit with this idea of reading into something, and how we might challenge that?
Well, I think, I'm not sure how everyone else feels about that, but I think it comes through in most people's work in the show that there are elements of coding in most of the works, and those elements aren't necessarily visible to all members of the community that's coming to see the exhibition. I think there's certain things that only are read by gay men are only read by lesbian women, are only read by trans people, etc., or read by people in the know, in the wider queer community, who have an idea of those symbols and those goings on, ways of speaking, ways of wording things that you can turn into visual language to an extent, and you know, turn into an object without having to say that thing outright. And that's where I think there has to be room for those different identities to be able to get something out of everything, but then also for audiences who aren't aware of that coding to be able to see something in that work, regardless of its content, regardless of the intent. And that's where I think the reading into it comes in. It's always important to me as an artist that regardless of what I put into the work, anyone can see something in it. And I think most people have that, and it was important with this show, knowing that a lot of the work is to an extent unreadable or difficult, that everyone who comes to see it can at least feel something about everything that's there. But I don't know how you feel about what you're putting into your works and what you're intending for people to get out of them.
I mean, with my work in particular, I've forgotten who said it, but an artist said an artwork should always be sort of readable, have about 10 readings. And I really like that, because even if the work is minimal, it takes ages and ages just to think through all the possibilities and how people interpret it. I mean, for example, my work, High Clone piece, which is latex, that's very much talking about the gay cultures in the 90s and AIDS and around the bodybuilding and leather clubs. So, of course, I'm using the latex that they were wearing in the clubs. I'm dressing it first with the talc. I think the aroma comes through, so there's subtleties and it is pulsating. It's, in a sense, it's quite literal, but it's just reducing it down. With minimalism, it's just, the best art, I think, in a sense, is you can just reduce it down to the minimum, and then it exists as a minimum. So that piece to me was sort of the best in the series. But I'm very much using, the material being the messages in the material. I'm using, that's very important. I think that makes
For you, that seems to be where the minimalism comes from, certainly not in terms of, like, saying meaning. It's at least 10.
Yes.
Oh, Garth, I've been named. I have the shape to speak. There's a lot of hidden language within my work. Like my piece that's called Pricks, which is literally a series of pricks. That's the kind of literal titling of something, rather than necessarily an aggressive term to another person, but you could interpret it in that way. But the colours themselves, I guess, look like aesthetic decisions, but all the colours are just colour specifications. So there's a coding, literally, in terms of the way you buy and interact with the process of buying material from home base or B&Q. So again, you bring in that machismo of a gay guy going to buy wood and paint and looking like he's about to build something, but he just decorates it and rests it against the wall. So there's kind of a playfulness there, and I guess you bring in camp into the conversation as well as queer. And then they're all called really ridiculous names, which I can't quite comprehend, but in a heteronormative society, it's like, let's paint our wall Dainty Daisy, because it's a lovely shade of yellow, and it's just, well, I've been called dainty for many of my younger years as a man, and so again, there's those contradictions in terms of within language in the everyday, and I find that really curious to then use that and reappropriate that. Within this sense of queerness or as an environment or an experience to have. But then to label all of those works with those names, I think would just be really obvious and potentially contrived of, I'm just going to give you everything that you need right now and let you go, and then you'll never want to find out anything else about me or what I do and why you're interested in the object first. So I guess it's not treating the audience like they're thick, and it's not about ostracising anybody. But the process of making for me is a personal one. But then I try not to put too much of myself in a work in a very literal way at the end. It's still about the material and the positioning of work in a space.
Well, I think, continues that. I think when you're making work, it's about that kind of narrative that you go through, this long process where you're trying to work through something to get to the end. And I think the best works and the most successful works do just still have that story and those layers behind them. It just depends on the finished piece of how much you want to give away, how much of yourself you want to kind of like show and lay bare when you're putting that thing. And maybe it might be that if you have a solo show, each one is slightly coded, and so if you put them all together, you might have like the full picture. But in a group show like this, it's quite nice to fracture that, and you've got these like small elements of very personal works and very personal stories that are kind of just beneath the surface. Usually there's a title that kind of starts to lead you down the path, or the fabric used and why that was used. So I have a piece in the show, Periphesia, which is the medical term for pins and needles, but using fiberglass insulating foam foil. Before that piece was finished, or I knew exactly what I was going to do with fiberglass, I was trying to work with it a lot because of the history of sort of female artists that were using those sort of materials in sort of the early 60s, 70s, that minimalist time, and Viva Hess and things, who then later went on to have health issues and die because of their use of those materials, and try and go back and sort of understand some of that heritage by trying to like quite literally. And I think it always starts off a bit literally, like you are just like, there's this thing that kind of grabs you, you want to literally go into that, but you're trying to sort of go through that, and so it's not going to have that kind of literal kind of nice rounded clean edge at the end, I don't think.
Well, that's really lovely to hear that story. Now, I mean, I hadn't heard that before. It makes me want to engage more in the work. So, in a sense, how do you give that to the people who are seeing the work? Because as a viewer, I'd love to know that.
I mean, there was there's a longer text I wrote for that piece with a few other pieces that went into much more detail about that. It was more prose than like an explanation in that way. But again, that's where I was sort of coming from. In that's a work from a solo show, so there was kind of a little bit more in-depth information at that time, and it went with some other works. But it's also quite nice to kind of cut those pieces off and send them away and see how they interact with other works, because it's made me look at them in different ways, and it brings new things to the work. And I think as well you have things like this where you can chat, and it gives you more to sort of discuss.
It seems a good opportunity to think a bit more about materials and materiality, which is something we were wandering around the show together. We're thinking about, because when we think of sort of archetypal minimalism, we're thinking about often a heroic, powerful relationship to materials, which is both between artist and objects, and also between object and viewer, or person who encounters the work in the space. I wonder how we're thinking about minimalism queerly, how that inflects and influences the way you work with materials. I mean, Charlotte, you talked about that really nicely. I mean, Ollie, you were saying something about it in relation to gloss and matte, and the interplay between those two. I mean, how does that fit with your sense of working queerly with materials?
Well, I think it was in an article that you sent me, a conversation between Jennifer Doyle and David Getze, saying that the sex in this queer work, this queer abstract work that they were discussing, wasn't necessarily in the form of what was happening within that painting or sculpture, because, as we've discussed, it's so hard to put something readable into those forms. But the sex or sexuality was then in the textures, the differences between things, between, in my paintings, the gloss paint and the sort of translucent matte fabric that they're painted on, or in sculptures between plastic and metal used in the same thing, one brittle, one very hard, between, in your work, the fiberglass and aluminium, two very different materials. There's that kind of distance between the two things, but working so closely together, and the friction that they create between them has, to me, a very sexual, bodily relationship. And I think it's quite easy to put queer readings onto that from the way that we're thinking about queerness in terms of our own bodies.
I think there's kind of flaring that comes through the sort of bodily creation of the works as well. So it's how these materials are coming together and working together that is being read through our own perspectives. So the metal works that I have are really quite simple, but they're literally just me shaping with the body, and I think that really comes through in terms of this very quite masculine, simple material being used in a slightly kind of different way rather than being shaped. It's just sort of formed through the body. And yeah, using these sort of soft and hard materials to counteract, push against. Like, we are often talking about it in a very bodily way.
But I think it's interesting, when I came to choose the works for this show, I mean, there was part of it that, because it was done online, stuff did turn up differently to what I kind of expected it to be from photographs. But once I had the work in hand, I sort of saw relationships within those materials and things that were happening. And although I didn't necessarily know, going back to the thinking about intention, what you were putting into works of any of the artists in the show, I had those same readings and same feelings about the way I was thinking about my own work. And then things started to come together, and those relationships become very bodily between each artist's artwork. So between yours and Liam's in that first room, for example, and and between your work and Rachel's in the second room, there are things that happen in between those things that, although they have different readings and different meanings, some of the contexts start to feel the same. And I didn't want the show to be this sort of regurgitation of high minimalism, using big steel cubes and things like that. The queering aspect of it had two parts. One, that it was involving queer artists, queer identifying artists, but the other, that it was upsetting that rhetoric of minimalism, and somehow trying to disrupt the way that we've come to think about minimalism and post-minimalism in terms of contemporary art.
Which is often this idea that it's neutral when it's clearly relating to power dynamics and like machismo and authority as well. One of the things I wanted to ask you, what struck me coming into the show, I mentioned this to you before, Rachel, is like, I'm going into the show about queer minimalism, and I'm thinking, am I going to see Oliver's work, and I'm going to see all this steel cubes, etc. And I'm struck by this like massive latex sentence. This language is what hits me when I come in. And then looking over the titles of some of the works, I was struck by how poetic a lot of them are, and secondly by how funny a lot of them are. And I'm kind of interested in how you see the relationship between minimalism and wordplay, because we were talking about this before, that actually all these works have really loaded, interesting, meaningful and sometimes funny titles.
I mean, in the sense that the title's the only clue someone's got to a piece. I mean, take for example, the grey triangle with the bent top. I forgot what that's called. Because life isn't pure, simple, silent, honest, and absolute. I mean, how that came about. I mean, most of my work is digital, and I work a lot on computers. And I was doing pricing analysis of gender based on the Royal Academy show. And Alan Charlton, I don't know if you know him, but he's a minimalist and he does grey triangles, exactly the same dimensions. And his piece was £60,000. So I basically just created it and bent it, just thinking, fuck that, you know what I mean? I mean, it's outrageous, the price difference between men and women. So yes, I sort of built it and then curved it, and I mean, it's as simple as that. And that sort of led on to several big digital pieces, but it was a sort of offshoot of this pricing analysis. It's basically, he describes his work as pure, simple, silent, honest and absolute, and I'm just thinking, well, fuck that, life isn't like that. So, and then the other one, which is the C-type print, the abstract, the death of Anna Mendieta, because a lot of my work, I say the initial work was queer or gay, and now I'm working more with women's issues and domestic violence, and stuff like that. You wouldn't know what it was. It just looks like an abstract, and basically it started off as a film, and it was just a shot from a film. I was generating the death scene of Anna Mendieta. The famous minimalist Carl Andre pushed his wife out the window. We're not meant to say that, but he did. And I basically mapped the death scene of her in CAD, and basically I was making a film, and that just struck me. It wasn't intended to be like that. So I guess the title leads you into that.
But there's still a level of abstraction in the title because it's called DOAM
Yes.
as part of a series. It's not, or it's subtitled.
That's right, because I subtitle most of my stuff, but I've also got that, asked you to put that text with it.
Yeah.
Because I want people to know, this is a 3D model of the death scene, do you know what I mean? There's her body, it was never documented when she fell or when it was removed. And it fell and removed just in twilight, it was never in daylight. And because I was doing exact modelling of the scene, it's basically at 7:30 when her body had gone, that's when the light would have just hit where she fell. And actually it nearly made me cry when I was doing that, and I just thought, that's great. And people react to that regardless of the text, which I find quite fascinating.
I found that work particularly such a powerful, politically charged way of queering minimalism, because we're doing this partly through, we're talking about like a bodily or sort of political relationship to materials, but there's a real like literal messing with minimalism that you're doing that I was so excited to see that work included in
exactly,
the show.
It's using the style of Carl Andre, because that was the idea, because Anna Mendieta and Carl Andre had such different styles, it was to use his style to sort of subvert what he'd done to her.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Worst ending to that lovely story. I really enjoy titling work. Like, not many people.
So I completely forgot what we were talking about, so Sarah wasted it. I'm really glad you were like, this is the question.
We're talking work.
But yeah, I really enjoy titling. It's kind of the fun bit of a process that sometimes can be very isolating and very intense as an artist. And what the fuck am I and what am I doing? And it's also the point that you start to offer something up to your audience too. You know, I don't think many artists still say that they make work for themselves, but I kind of do, because it's not work that usually has a price tag on, and it's not something that's tangible in terms of on a canvas or in that kind of way. So my process feels queer to me and to people that look at it, but then the titles are the playfulness and the campness and the kind of misses, which I think is really relevant in every day in terms of it erases kind of potential attack because you're being playful with language and interaction. You know, all of those things do still exist, but how a gay guy walking down the streets of Blackpool, Brexit Central, thanks, how you are still playful with your environment and how you still are tongue-in-cheek and you shrug it all off and then you present something different in a subcultural way. So yeah, titling to me is ace. Like, Pricks is just so direct, and the last time it was installed it was against a window that was street facing in the gallery that I run in Blackpool. Sometimes curators put their own work in their shows, sorry. Times are hard. But then people walk past and hit the window because they know they can disrupt the balance of something. So instantly you add a relationship there that you never expected. So, but then that also informs the way that you then might retitle something, because it's no longer the same piece, it's something else now because of the way it's been affected by others. Which is why when it came here it was called Pricks, because it was like, someone's just going to mess with this, aren't they? And that's going to annoy me. And then the 9 inches away, apart, together, repeat is kind of a full body of work, but then I break that down into different elements with triangles that are kind of as you walk in, like something out of the game of Sims, like a destinations guide. And then the distance between them, so that the fact that there's nothing there, but that gap is very specific through all my work of 9 inches, and that's to do with being asked whether I had a 9-incher on dating apps. And just no, I haven't. No. Yeah, but everyone's left Facebook now. All the fans.
Are you just giving it out?
Yeah, just giving it out. I'm a bunch of pricks. So yeah, that distance becomes very embedded in the relationships between my materials, because we were talking about materials. Sorry. But then how you create sense out of nonsense, because it's ridiculous for someone's first interaction with you to ask that question. So then how you create measurement out of that in a formal arrangement of things and stuff. That's where my work's kind of going at the moment.
It's just more about queering maximalism than 9 inches.
I mean, obviously, if I was going to talk about my own, everything would be much further apart.
Do you have anything to add?
Sorry, everyone.
I'm going to be much more dull. I think it just comes back to sort of what I mentioned before, when you're kind of creating work, whether it's something that kind of comes to you, you just have to make sort of an anger against something else, or if it's a really long journey or something quite personal, titling something is that like last little gift outwards, or it can even be like to conceal something as well. But hopefully, I tend to think that it's like little breadcrumbs, and there's lots of little breadcrumbs throughout the work, through the title, through text, the show, however it might come by, that it's breadcrumbs to back to where you were thinking. So it's kind of like bringing you back to this sort of whole idea.
It's nice to think about those kind of titles as being as open and closed off as we are about gender or sexuality to different people, you know, giving away certain things like within the wordplay that certain people might, it goes back to this coding, that certain people might recognise, but certain people can still get something out of those words, or if it's pure wordplay, you know, people who don't recognise the coding within it can still appreciate that, and it can add still to the artwork. That's quite a nice way of relating it back to queerness as a way of being rather than as a way of making.
I really like this idea of titling as a means of concealing as well as disclosing. I think that's really poetic. So I've got one more question before we open it up to our audience. It's quite a big one. So this exhibition is supported in part by the Albert Kennedy Trust, which is one way that it's queer. The exhibition wears its queer politics on its sleeve. Another is, you know, through the content of some of the works, as we've been talking about. And I'm interested in what you think. What are the challenges facing queer identified artists today?
It's a big question.
Yeah.
I told you it was a big one.
I think a lot of the challenges will be the same as those facing queer people today. We're at a point in Britain anyway where LGBT issues have come to the fore in recent years. You know, gay marriage was legalised a couple of years ago, a couple of years after civil partnerships were legalised. Now trans rights are starting to come to the foreground of discussions, but there is an element of assimilationism, and it's whether people, everyone is different, of course, and whether people go down the route of assimilationism or whether they go down the route of using queerness, using their gender or alternative gender or sexuality as a political way of being, as a political way of speaking, or if you're an artist, of making work. And that's, I think, where the difference is between queer artists and artists who are queer. You know, there are loads of lesbian, gay, etc. artists making work that's not about their sexuality. Of course, you know, everyone has a bit of themselves in what they do, but that's not at the forefront of their work. That's fine, but there are a lot of great artists, included in the show, some, who are making work where sexuality is at the forefront of what they're doing, and it is being used in a political way, where it is coming forward and saying something, whatever that thing is, because it's different for all of us involved, about queer issues in contemporary society. And I think the same kind of ways of thinking about how we talk, how we are in public, are important to people who are not artists, not creators, as well. And I think they're very similar things.
Yeah. I mean, I think in terms of talking about assimilation as well, then I think that comes to sort of this definition, or the way we're talking about queer and queering, and what queerness meant to us as people as well as artists at the start. And there's almost sort of a murkiness in what that politically and even socially means now as well. So I think it's trying to sort of work through that for yourself as well as for your art, and working through that and make sure it's relevant for you. But it's also it's tricky out there. I tend to find I was included in a lineup of shows at an incredible gallery, but I won't name anything, but where it was about being all women, they were given solo shows too. And I kind of made a joke after having a meeting with them of like, with some friends, like, yeah, I'll be that woman. You know, you're getting sort of a solo show, so it's this question of how much are you kind of bringing yourself into it, at a point of having like a show that I really wanted to, with a gallery I really wanted to work with, and they were incredible anyway, and we did end up having discussions later, but being brought in sort of because of perceptions that don't actually align with my gender identity. It is always sort of trying to manoeuvre that, so in some spaces like this, which has been great, like you can just really kind of revel and bring that forward, whereas other times I do kind of inadvertently like manoeuvre. You put certain parts of yourself forward, and it's like we're saying about coded language, and sometimes you don't quite realise you're doing it in this sort of like in the art world. Generally kick myself afterwards, or to be like an annoying, angry queer all the time.
Do you have anything to add before we open?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges for me in terms of queerness, queer culture, queer art kind of today is whether it's just piecemeal or not right now, and then how a conversation carries on, how an understanding of queerness as an environment or an experience within the display of art is sustained. Because I think a fear or an anxiety right now as an artist who's kind of been working for 10 years, but I guess started to come out a bit more in terms of bringing my own self into my work more rather than what I think I should make for that place. Whether that feels like it's just a really lovely year to be doing that in is a fear. So I think that's a challenge. Personally, when you're making and in that process and headspace, but then also whether everybody's just on a bandwagon for a period of time and then what happens next.
Yeah.
It is so powerful to be putting yourself in your work by putting that out there. I mean, we're in such a privileged position here to be able to do that, to be able to present. There's so many people that can't, so many people that won't see that representation. So I think there is sort of that thing of like, is this going to dip? Is this sort of the kind of political catchphrase? But if we can kind of keep punching through and keep making it relevant, then hopefully it lasts longer. At least the real stuff will.
Yeah. Absolutely. Shall I open?
We're open.
Does anyone have any questions? I mean, it can be questions to a particular artist on the panel, or general questions that you'd like everyone to respond to. Or
Good evening. Is it more important to you to be an artist or to be queer?
I'm not sure if the queer part is a choice. But I don't know if many people it's art.
It's a choice.
Oh,
I'm saying
okay.
it's more important to you
Yeah.
to be queer or to be an artist? Or to be a queer artist, which is that's just a general question to all of you.
I don't mind answering.
Yeah,
In case everyone was it's more important for me to be an artist because I think my process of making as an artist is inevitably queer. So I don't need to force it. As an artist, I make queer work. It's not about that I am queer, then trying to make art. The art comes first.
I think being an artist, then you could say the same thing about being queer. You have such a sense of being and such a personal connection to what you're doing because it's not a normal job. You know, you're not going to sit at, well, some people do, you're not going to sit at a desk 9 to 5, 5 days a week. It involves such an outpouring of yourself that, like you say, how you are, your gender, your sexuality, the way you identify is always going to be a part of that. So I think if you're queer, you can do whatever you want. If you're an artist, yourself is always going to be a part of it. So I think being an artist, again, to me, is more important because who I am, regardless of who that is, will always be a part of that.
I think for similar reasons, mine's probably the opposite. Just in that who I am is at the forefront. Like, that's my being. So that has to come first. And I mean, it takes kind of constant reminding of like to be that, to keep pushing forward with who I am, and like, so art is a way of doing that, of practicing, of being. But I think like to be queer as part of who I am, that's the point.
We're not allowed to say choice, are we?
Well, that's very nice.
So you can present
I'm just curious because I mean, for me, I can still can't get to grips with the word queer. A woman, that's what I identify. And because of the women's struggle and all the shit that's still going down, that's why I'm an artist, because my work focuses on a lot of feminist and gender violence. So if the world was fair and equal, I probably wouldn't be an artist. I'd probably be a joiner.
This probably plays completely, so thanks so much, it's been really great. And maybe this is unfair, but I felt that what you said, Rachel, about queerness and you straight, I just really wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit more about what you mean by that. I'm really interested in the dissertation too, and I thought that was worth, sorry, just a little bit more.
Well, I guess I was brought up in times where we really had a lot to kick off against, you know. It was before I mean marriage, you know, I was on the course 28, AIDS broke out. I mean, there was really, you know, I had to be in at work because I worked in a very straight environment in the city. I forgot my question. No, I'm getting there. Yes. And then I sort of disappeared for a while. And when I came back, everything had changed. And there was this fashion. Queer is very fashionable at the moment. And there's a lot of what I call straight people doing gay art and capitalising on that. And that annoys me. I'm not being very eloquent. I'm just saying how I just feel about it. That annoys me. Because the politics have gone. It's still when you go on marches in London, like you go, you know, like go and reclaim the night and stuff like that. None of these people are there, you know, and there's still a lot to fight for. So it's kind of, you're wearing it as a sort of a label sometimes. Does that make sense?
Are you angry with the commodification of queerness?
Yes.
Rather than queerness as sort of a political refusal of labels?
Yes. Yeah. That's exactly it. I mean, you know, I haven't been to a gay club for donkey years, about 20 years, and I went to one the other day because of something, and it was just full of straight people. And I didn't, you know, apparently that sounds okay, but there's a couple of old school ones who we just feel uncomfortable there. And, you know, one woman was giving me the eagles. She was sort of like snogging her boyfriend on the dance floor, and I just felt confused. And I just felt there's nowhere to go, because, I mean, you know, the gay male club had disappeared because everyone grinded and shagging each other in their own home. Yeah, and
someone that messaged me, I can't.
But it's
women have no money, so
I mean, in some gentrification does have a huge impact on like loss of queer spaces like bars in cities like London. More questions, yes.
Thinking about talking about codification and coding, and then obviously talking about interpretation and things like this, I was wondering particularly about your position as the artist, and then occasionally obviously position as the curator, the responsibility of maybe unpacking that coding, or kind of, you know, I think there was a really interesting thing as well that was brought up about titles, where sometimes titles kind of revealed something and sometimes they hid something, and I thought there was something quite nice in that kind of, you're talking about culture as well, kind of maybe keeping that culture for yourself almost. So I was wondering whether you would talk about different approaches to unpacking coding for the audience as artist and or as curator, and where that responsibility sort of lies.
yeah, because in a sense, I mean, if you've been to art conference, you want to say something?
No.
I mean, and you're taught how to unpack, you know, the signs and significations and stuff like that. So it depends who you're making the work for, because I understand if I've got something quite minimal that someone who's been to art college will be able to break down that coding, but there's someone just off the street who hasn't will just go, oh, what's that? So you're sort of playing into that. I mean, I very much think you should give everyone everything. You know, I don't try to conceal anything. You know, I can spend months on a piece, and it's important that everyone knows everything. So I started to write that all.
Yeah.
Whereas some people feel differently.
No, I completely agree. I mean, there's an irony to my practice, because I work within the arts, which is all about engagement and everybody understanding everything from start to finish and even the middle, and then you evaluate it excessively. And then as an artist, it's about what's true to you first as a process, but then also a different way of engaging with somebody rather than giving all the material, because it actually disconnects them from the experience of engaging with the thing that you've made. So I have a very kind of dual role as an artist, curator and project manager, which is dull as dishwater when you think of the term of PM. It's completely different. So the idea that someone can come and talk to me is still interesting, and that's still valuable in terms of having a conversation about the whole piece, rather than having to put it all in front of them there and then in case I'm not there. That fear of removing yourself and then not having the whole story, I don't think that's what art's there to do, to give everything that they ever desired, because art will never do that. And if you're approaching art in that way, then that's a silly expectation to have. But to work with coding and just everybody, I guess your approach, I'm going off on a tangent, your approach to looking at a thing is to try and assume that it's got a set function or a reason for it being there. Sometimes it doesn't have a reason, and then I guess you get into kind of minimalism and this kind of idea that it's neutral but never neutral, and it's what is it doing? Is it okay to do nothing? And we all would love to do nothing in society at some point. So maybe it's okay for an artwork to exist as nothing in someone's mind, but in someone else's mind exists as completely everything they needed in that moment. But then also break it down to it's stone, it's hard, it's rough, it's wood, it's raw, or it's painted. You know, in those really basic senses of analysing a material, which then if you analyse it in a very literal sense of what you're looking at, that does start to create a narrative. Whether that's the artist's narrative or not is kind of irrelevant in that moment, because you're already telling your own story, in my opinion. And I think it's okay to let someone else take ownership of your work, even though you've got a story to be told, if someone wants to ask you, but it's also fine if someone else says it's not that, and I think it's this.
Well, that's what I wanted to do with this show, and that's why the show is called You're Reading Into It. And as the curator, I'm in the sort of privileged position of having artist statements and texts from the submissions that all the artists made, explaining in quite a lot of detail a lot of the time what each work was about and why it was a certain way or size or colour. But then writing the gallery sheet, A, you don't want to overload people with information, especially when you're doing a 7-artist show. But B, like Garth said, you have to have room for people to read into it what they want. Not what they want to see, but what they feel that they can take from it. So if it is that it's rough stone and that gives me this sensation, or that it's this difference between textures of fiberglass and aluminium, that's another thing. The implication of what everything in the show is given by the subtitle. We know coming into it that this is a queer show about queering minimalism. But there's still a lot of room left within everyone's work for each visitor to have their own interpretation of what's going on. And I think that's vital to making a show that's interesting for both the artists involved and for the audience.
I think when we talk about coding too, your body is coded, your being is already coded. So sometimes it's not even sort of, you're putting coding into it anyway, but a lot of the time it's just there in the work. I tend to gravitate to other works by non-binary, queer, female artists, and I think that probably comes because the works, and that's not that they're saying that's who they are, it's just that's what I gravitate to, because that's my personal experiences coming through. It's their body touching that work, and then that's saying something to me. So I think as an artist I feel a lot less of that responsibility. I tend to just be making work, and then it's a lot of the time, if it's quite personal work, that's when I might hold back on some stuff. So I had a show where a lot of the works I went to the original Latin names, which was important to how I'd first come to the names. They were named after saints, so it'd been how I'd originally come to them from my wonderful Catholic upbringing. But also it is sort of maybe a way of like stepping that back a little bit and being more for the other kids that have maybe had that similar upbringing. Unless people want to dig in more, and I'm very happy to talk to them more about it. But I think as a curator, I definitely feel, and I don't know if you felt this, but I feel more, when I have curated shows, I feel more of a responsibility with that. You're writing the text for the show, that's people's way in. I think like artists can write horrendous, like, well, not horrendous, but in terms of like, it can be quite coded if you're writing your own blurb for a show, your own bio or something, it can be more poetic or prose, whereas I think if you're coming from it as a curator that's brought together artists, you want people to kind of have that way in, to be brought in, to be brought around the conversation and to engage them in that conversation. So I think whenever I've curated shows, I've been much more aware of that and trying to kind of break some of that down. And then you do events like this too, where you try and bring people out and you break it down further. So that's sort of, at least from my experience, how.
It is interesting, from a gallerist's hat on, it's really interesting to hear that, because it's exactly, it's a balance to be struck. And we're writing gallery sheets, explanatory material. It's a question of that, of giving, I call hooks to an audience, to get people to start to, not to explain the work, but to actually give them ways into it, different ways, and different people need different things. Obviously, they come to it with, as you said, with a different level of pre-knowledge. They're not, so as a gallery audience, as a gallery, you have to be aware that not everybody that comes to the door is fully art literate, whatever that means. But so you have to give it, you have to be aware of that balance. It's a difficult one, and sometimes we have had artists, I'm not mentioning names in the past, but so you're dumbing down my words. No, we're actually creating a level where people can actually come into it. And if you mention somebody's name, a writer or a philosopher, you have to actually do more than say, this person said this. You have to give a little bit more than that. You have to actually give people a hook. And it's I'm not really making a question here, but it's just an observation that it's that balance which is a gallerist you're perhaps sometimes more aware of than the artists are. And you can get it wrong, and we've had some very, very good shows. There's an interesting show by an artist, Craig Wilson. This is not a criticism of the show at all, which was a fantastic show. It was portraits of gay servicemen and women, or had been serving, and transgendered. And it was very, very popular. People came in, the photographs were amazing, beautifully done. But the people wanted, there was a sense of frustration that they didn't have the backstories. And that's when we were able to talk to people, and we had the backstories and talk to them. And it's a very difficult balance. Maybe we should have had more about the backstories.
So I love that the term of talking about it as a hook. I really like that, because people want and need different amounts of information depending on their backgrounds and stuff. So sometimes there is that worry of putting too much information out there, and just like you were saying, overloading people. Because I actually went to a show and it was really interesting. There was sort of portraits, and there was a whole backstory from the book now. The portraits were stunning, but underneath each one was this huge text of information about that individual's backstory. And it was interesting, but there was like over 50 portraits, and it was exhausting. And after a bit, I zoned out of some, and it's a completely different experience than taking that in and having
it's
that
balance again.
motive. So yeah, it's trying to
balance.
Some kind of balance.
I think we need to wrap up. But I'm sure some of our panellists are happy to be asked other questions. But thanks everyone for coming. It's such a great audience, and thank you to our artists, Charlotte, Garth, Rachel and Oliver. Thank you.